Hello, and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week. This is episode number 181. Today, I am taking a look at the 1972 self-titled debut from Styx. Styx? On a metal-related channel? Yes. Long before they became the butt of all jokes, they were much different and were a relatively unknown band in 1972. So, before I get into my thoughts on the 1972 debut, let me bring up some history facts for you all. Styx originally started out as a small cover band named the Tradewinds, formed by both Chuck and John Pinozzo, the Pinozzo brothers, in 1961 at 12 years of age. It also consisted of a then 14-year-old Dennis DeYoung, who at the time was their neighbor. By 1968, they ended up changing their name to TW4 after adding guitar player John Kuralewski. Then in 1970, they added another member. That member was James J.Y. Young, and thus turning TW4 into a quintet. By 1971, I believe as initially TW4, they entered Paragon Recording Studios in Chicago to record what would become their debut album. But by signing with the small label Wooden Nickel Records, they changed their name from TW4 to the now solidified name, that is Styx, and the rest is history. So by August of 1972, Styx's debut album gets released. The album here contains 6 tracks and clocks in at 33 minutes and 3 seconds. So these 6 tracks are beginning with the 13-minute and 14-second epic titled Movement for the Common Man, which is actually built of 4 parts, that being Children of the Land, Street Collage, Fanfare for the Common Man, and Mother's Nature Matinee. Then, of course, we then get into Right Away, What Has Come Between Us, Best Thing, Quick as the Beat of My Heart, and then finally ending with After You Leave Me. So there's your 6 tracks. Alright. My introduction to Styx began with hearing my father's cassette copy of Pieces of 8, which contains some of Styx's most biggest songs that are still heard on classic rock radio. At the time, I was still a young kid who was in 3rd grade. At the time, it rocked my world. I couldn't stop listening to it, and it made me wanting to invest in checking out more of their albums. Eventually, my father ended up buying, off the BMG Club's website, a copy of the Come Sail Away, the Anthology 2 CD album, which introduced me to a little bit of their early stuff. I didn't get to hear any of the Wooden Nickel albums until many years later when I had more access to my father's record collection. All he had, though, were just Styx 2, which didn't even have the record in its sleeve. It'd been missing for many moons ago, probably before I was even born. And 1974's Man of Miracles, which for the longest time was the only Wooden Nickel album I had ever listened to. But because I was more familiar with their signature FM radio-based sound that they developed since Crystal Ball and of course Tommy Shaw, and then expanded on that all the way through to Paradise Theater, and then going even further with 1983's Killware Was Here, which spawned the mega hit that was Mr. Roboto, which did the band no favors. So, because being more familiar with their more accessible stuff, I began to become more intrigued by their pre-FM radio / Tommy Shaw years. So let's fast forward to even before I checked out Man of Miracles. Sometime in 2011, I believe, I remember listening to one of the satellite radio stations, and a Styx song came on that I never heard before, titled Midnight Ride, taken off 1975's Equinox. It was a pretty hard rockin' song, and Styx aren't the most well-known band for their, they weren't very known for the hard rock songs, let alone maybe Miss America off of The Grand Illusion. This is what sparked me to want to invest more in the pre-Tommy Shaw albums. So I did end up listening to Equinox, and that blew me away. And then I listened to Man of Miracles. These were the only Kurolusi albums that I was familiar with until last year when my brother bought the 2005 Wood Nickel album set, which had all 4 albums. So this was finally my way of giving the other pre-Shaw albums a go. So let me get into the 1972 Styx album here. This is a weird one. It does have its moments of prog, because they were definitely really playing around with a little bit of the proggier sound during this period, but it's not quite as developed. It's much more confined to a late 60s, early 70s garage rock structure than what the other albums would end up being, especially when you get into the Tommy Shaw era albums. Imagine a less bombastic Rush, the early albums before 2112, with a little bit of Uriah Heep, but the lighter side of Uriah Heep. Mostly some of the later albums to an extent. A little bit, maybe some of the lighter side of some of the ones with David Byron. It's just not quite realized yet. The only prog moment on the album, to me, is with the 13-minute and 14-second epic Movement for the Common Man. It's composed of 4 parts. The first is Children of the Land, total James Young composition. Then there is the second part in this epic that is titled Street Collage. This is a fucking strange part. All it is a recording of interviews with guys from Chicago acting like people from Chicago, talking like people from Chicago. It's mostly a bunch of rambling nonsense with one guy going on about how kids got too much money and don't know the struggle of being poor and shit. Going to, the kid, they all got this money. You didn't get everything. Yeah. Oh my god. It's fucking jarring. It almost doesn't belong. It sounds out of place. Then the next part is Fanfare for the Common Man, a 1942 piece that was originally composed by Aaron Copland. This has to be Dennis DeYoung's edition. I believe it has to be, given he's kind of... He always comes across as kind of like the more knowledgeable, almost very smart kind of guy in the band, just to an extent. He kind of always... the aura of him just came across like that. So I'm kind of wondering if that was his addition to the track, alright? Then it caps off with Mother Nature's Matinee, a sort of proggy folk piece. The track as a whole is pretty ambitious, but not as gripping as what they would do with their other albums. As for the rest of the album, it is pretty straightforward. To me, the album gets much more interesting with the last 3 tracks. Best Thing is where James Young and Dennis DeYoung start to try and find their voice. Not as gripping as anything on The Serpent is Rising or Equinox, in my opinion, but it rocks and is a very enjoyable track. Quick is the Beat of My Heart, written by a guy named Mark Gaddis, who, not very familiar with him, and apparently some people state this as a cover, but I looked up his discography on Discogs, and none of the albums he's ever recorded on or whatever features the track Quick is the Beat to My Heart. So I'm kind of wondering if he wrote this just for Styx. Now, I digress. It has a funky groove to it. This plays around with a style that best reminds me of Uriah Heep, but not nearly as much as the track Man of Miracles does. It's still kind of heavy, and it still is a very fun and is pretty much a band trying to find its footing. Great keyboard solo, though, from Dennis DeYoung in the track. Really freaking cool one. Again, normally when people think of organ players or keyboard players in rock and roll in this period, especially when it comes to this style, since I've already made comparisons to Rye Heap. Many people also would think of John Lord of Deep Purple, but to me, Dennis DeYoung's keyboard solo styling, whatever, reminds me more of Ken Hensley. So there's a little bit of that Ken Hensley feel to Dennis DeYoung's keyboard sound on here, and especially for some of the other Styx albums, at least maybe pre-Equinox or Crystal Ball. It just was a really cool sound that I felt got more developed on The Serpent is Rising. Alright, so I digress there. Now, finally, After You Leave Me, which is a Griffin cover, which is best known for having George Clinton. It has that funk/soul vibe to it, but Styx gives it a heavy rock edge that makes it all their own and ends the album quite nicely. So all in all, Styx's debut is a very fun and enjoyable album from a band who is just beginning to find their voice. By their next album, they would begin to develop and sharpen their sound. Alright, so for those who are into Styx and have an appreciation for the 1972 debut, whether they be positive or negative, again, your comments, you can leave your comments in the comment section below. But if you haven't listened to their 1972 album and are wondering what would be a good place to start, to dive into their pre-FM radio era / Tommy Shaw and everything, my suggestions would be The Serpent is Rising and Equinox, especially when it comes to Equinox for those who want to hear the transition from the wood nickel era sound to the more refined era that Tommy Shaw would usher in for Styx by Crystal Ball and then into the Grand Illusion and Pieces of Eight. So there we go. There it is, folks. There's my overall thoughts on Styx's self-titled debut album from 1972. And again, it's already reached its 40th anniversary anyways this year. So with that, I hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrash Head saying I'm out. And I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.